Please, don't make me undress, she begged. But the cold millionaire had no choice. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main characters. Ryan Davenport was a man who exuded an aura of power. A millionaire, known for his calculated moves in both business and life. He was the epitome of a man who had everything under control. His sharp suits, expensive watches, and the aura of authority that followed him wherever he went made him someone most people both admired and feared. But behind that cold exterior, there was a life that he had carefully constructed, one where emotions were kept at bay, where nothing could get in the way of his success. Sophie Adams, on the other hand, was nothing like Ryan. She was a woman who had known struggle, uncertainty, and was always looking for a way out of the life she had found herself in. Sophie wasn't used to the luxuries that came so naturally to Ryan. Her life had been one of modesty, and although she had her dreams, she knew that her current circumstances often held her back. But fate, as it often does, had different plans for her. One day, their paths crossed in an unexpected and tense situation. Sophie had been caught up in a series of events that she couldn't control, events that led her to Ryan's doorstep. He was a man with a reputation, and Sophie had heard enough about him to know that he was not someone you crossed. She had no idea how she had ended up in this position, but here she was, caught between the desire to protect herself and the need to move forward. The air was thick with tension as Sophie stood in front of Ryan, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and confusion. Please, don't make me undress, she begged, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to keep herself composed. Her words hung in the air, a silent plea, but Ryan's expression remained unchanged. He was a man who had long since learned to shut out the pleas of others, and Sophie's desperate cry was no exception. I don't have a choice, he said flatly, his tone as cold as the marble floor beneath their feet. His eyes, though piercing, betrayed no hint of empathy. Sophie could feel a chill run down her spine as she realized the magnitude of the situation she was in. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, what would happen next? Ryan's gaze never wavered as he considered the situation, and Sophie, though frightened, understood that there was no turning back. Whatever was about to happen, she would have to face it head-on. As the room stood still in that moment of palpable tension, Sophie tried to steady her breath. She felt the weight of Ryan's gaze, cool and unyielding, pressing down on her. The words she had just uttered hung in the air between them like an unspoken challenge. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered for a brief second, but there was no softness in them, no sign of mercy. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, and despite the tightness in her throat, she stood firm, unwilling to let her fear completely consume her. This wasn't how she had imagined this encounter going. She had never planned to be in a position where her dignity felt like it was slipping away in an instant. But there she was, caught in a web of circumstances she couldn't control, with Ryan Davenport, the cold millionaire, holding all the cards. You're not going to get out of this that easily, Ryan said in a low, deliberate tone, his voice devoid of warmth. Sophie swallowed hard, every inch of her wanting to escape the suffocating feeling of helplessness. But she knew there was nowhere to run. She had to face this head-on, even if she had no idea what the consequences would be. As the silence stretched between them, Sophie's mind raced. What did Ryan want from her? What did he expect to happen next? She could feel the weight of his authority, and it terrified her. But she also understood that fear wasn't going to help her now. If she was going to survive this, she had to hold on to something stronger, her resolve. I don't want to do this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but enough to break the tense silence. I don't want to be part of whatever you're planning. Ryan's lips twitched into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He seemed to be analyzing her, measuring her every word and every move. It's not about what you want, Sophie, he replied, his tone cool as ever. Sometimes, life doesn't give you the luxury of choice. Sophie flinched at the mention of her name. The way he said it, detached, impersonal, made her feel even smaller, like she was just another piece in a game that she didn't even understand. She wanted to fight back, to assert herself, but the reality of her situation kept her rooted in place. The fear, the confusion, the overwhelming sense of being out of control, all weighed heavily on her shoulders. She tried to think back to her life before this moment, the life where she had hopes and dreams, where she wasn't trapped in a situation like this. But those thoughts seemed distant, as though they belonged to someone else. "You don't have to be afraid," Ryan said, almost as if he could sense her growing distress. But there was no comfort in his words, only the cold assurance that everything was happening according to his design. "You're not the first person to feel like this, and you won't be the last." Sophie's mind was racing, and as she stood there, trying to process everything that was unfolding, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a simple encounter. Something deeper, something more intricate was at play. She had no idea what Ryan was really after, but she could sense that her role in this was far from over. The decision wasn't hers to make, not yet. But one thing was for certain. This encounter would change everything for her. She just didn't know how or why. For now, all she could do was brace herself and wait for whatever Ryan had planned next. The room remained thick with tension, and Sophie could feel her pulse racing as the seconds ticked by. Ryan's presence loomed over her like a shadow, unwavering and cold, but Sophie was determined not to let herself crumble. Despite the dread coiling in her stomach, she tried to maintain her composure. It was as if everything around her had frozen, the walls closing in, leaving her feeling trapped in a situation she could not control. "What do you want from me?" Sophie asked, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. She had to find out. She had to understand what had led her here. Ryan didn't respond immediately, his gaze never leaving hers. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Sophie could feel the weight of his eyes, as if he was assessing her, looking for something beneath her facade of calm. "I told you, Sophie." Ryan finally spoke, his voice as cold and unfeeling as it had been before. "Life doesn't always give us what we want. Sometimes, we have to accept what's given to us." Sophie's breath hitched, and her mind raced as she tried to make sense of his words. What did he mean? Was this just some kind of power play? Was he trying to break her? She had no answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay strong. "Please, just let me go. I didn't ask for this." Ryan's expression remained impassive, but there was something behind his eyes, a flicker of something that Sophie couldn't quite place. She couldn't tell if it was pity, indifference, or something darker. It didn't matter. The reality was that Sophie had no choice in the matter. She was caught in his web, and there was no escaping it. "You think you have a choice?" Ryan's voice was almost mocking now, though there was a hint of something more behind it, something that felt like a challenge. Sophie swallowed hard, the reality of her situation sinking deeper into her bones. "You're in my world now, Sophie," he continued, his tone turning colder with each word. "And in my world, things don't work the way you expect. If you want to survive, you have to learn to play by my rules." Sophie's heart sank. This wasn't what she had imagined when she first walked into that room. She had thought that maybe, just maybe, Ryan was someone who could help her, someone who could get her out of the mess she had found herself in. But instead, she was now realizing the truth. Ryan didn't care about her. She was just another player in a game she didn't understand. "You'll learn soon enough," Ryan said, his eyes narrowing as he watched Sophie closely. "You'll learn what happens when you don't follow the rules." Sophie's thoughts were a whirlwind. How had she ended up here? She had never wanted to be part of a power struggle like this. She had always been someone who avoided confrontation, someone who just wanted peace. But now, everything had changed. She was no longer in control. The realization hit her like a wave, and for a brief moment, she felt completely powerless. She had no idea what Ryan had planned for her, but she knew one thing for sure. It wasn't going to be easy. Whatever happened next, Sophie would have to face it. There was no turning back now. The world she had known, the one where she could make decisions for herself, was gone. She had no idea what would come next, but she knew that she had to survive this. There was no other option. Sophie stood in the silence that followed, her mind racing, her body on edge, as Ryan's cold gaze never wavered from hers. It was a standoff, and neither of them was willing to blink first. Ryan stood across from Sophie, his expression as unreadable as ever. The tension in the air was thick, and Sophie could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Every inch of her body screamed to escape, to run, but she knew that wasn't an option. Not anymore. She had been caught in Ryan's world, and there was no getting out of it. The silence stretched on, and for a moment, it felt like time had frozen. Sophie's heart was racing, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had no idea what Ryan wanted from her, but she could tell that whatever it was something she couldn't refuse. "You're thinking too much," Ryan said, breaking the silence with his calm, almost casual tone. Sophie snapped her head up, meeting his gaze. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice betraying the panic she was trying so hard to hide. Ryan gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You're overthinking the situation. It's simple, really. You're here because you have no other choice. You think you can walk away, but you can't. Not from me." Sophie felt a chill run down her spine at the finality in his words. He was right, of course. She had no power in this situation. She was at his mercy, and he knew it. But that didn't mean she had to accept it. "I don't have to stay here," Sophie said, her voice shaky but determined. "I don't have to play your game." Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her feel small, insignificant. "You think you have the luxury of choice, Sophie?" he asked, his voice lower now, more controlled. "In this world, people like you don't get to choose. You adapt. You survive. Or you get left behind." Sophie swallowed hard, trying to ignore the rising fear in her chest. She had heard people like Ryan before. People who believed that power was everything, that the strong survived while the weak perished. But she wasn't like them. She had her own strength. She just had to find it. "I won't be one of those people," Sophie said, her voice firmer this time, though it still trembled slightly. "I won't be your pawn." Ryan chuckled softly, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was more of a challenge, a reminder that he held the power in this situation. "You already are," he said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "But you don't have to like it. That's the reality you're in now. You'll learn to live with it, or you won't." The words stung, but Sophie refused to show how much they hurt. She wasn't going to let Ryan break her. She had to keep her head above water, no matter what. "What do you want from me?" Sophie asked again, her voice quieter now, the earlier fire in her tone replaced with uncertainty. Ryan's eyes softened for a moment, just the slightest flicker of something passing through them. "I told you already," he said, his voice still cold but with a hint of something else beneath it. "You're here because you have no choice. But that doesn't mean you're powerless." Sophie wasn't sure what he meant by that, but she knew that she had to hold on to whatever shred of control she had left. She wasn't going to let him win. Not yet. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time, Sophie saw a flicker of something that might have been pity, or maybe something else entirely. "What happens next is up to you," he said, his tone softening just a fraction. "But remember, you're not in charge here. Not anymore." Sophie stood there, still trapped in Ryan's world, still caught in the web of power he had spun around her. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: she was going to have to fight. And she was ready to fight with everything she had. The air in the room felt heavier now, thicker with unspoken tension. Sophie stood before Ryan, her mind racing, her heart thumping in her chest. He was right about one thing: she had no choice. Her mind kept replaying his words. Asterisk, "You're not in charge here. Not anymore." Asterisk, she had to face the reality of it. No matter how much she hated it, no matter how much she wanted to fight back, there was a sense of inevitability hanging over her. But that didn't mean she would go down without a fight. Sophie's thoughts were a whirlwind as she searched for any kind of foothold in the chaos of her emotions. She couldn't let herself fall into despair. She wasn't weak. She had fought her entire life for what little she had, and she wasn't going to let someone like Ryan Davenport strip that from her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I'm not your pawn," Sophie said, her voice trembling but filled with quiet defiance. "I will find a way out of this." Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "You think you can just walk away from this? From me?" His voice was calm, almost amused, as though he found her resistance entertaining. "You're not in control, Sophie. You never were. His words cut through her like a sharp blade, but Sophie didn't flinch. She couldn't. She had to stay strong. Then what do you want from me? Sophie demanded, her frustration mounting. She was tired of the games, the manipulation, the uncertainty. She needed answers. I already told you, Ryan replied, his tone unchanged. You're here because you have no choice. You're stuck. And as for what I want from you, that's something we'll figure out together. Sophie's heart sank as she heard his words. Together, it sounded like a twisted kind of agreement, but Sophie knew. Better than to think she was in any position to negotiate. Ryan was the one holding all the cards. He had all the power, and she had nothing. This is not what I want, Sophie said quietly, almost to herself. I didn't ask for this. Ryan didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, his gaze unwavering. For a moment, it almost felt like he was studying her, as though trying to figure out what made her tick. What made her so determined to resist him? You never get what you want in life, Ryan said finally, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful. You adapt. You learn. You survive. Sophie swallowed, her throat tight. What if I don't want to adapt? What if I don't want to survive in your world? She asked, her voice softer, but filled with the same defiance. Ryan's lips twitched upward, just slightly, but there was no warmth in the gesture. You don't have a choice. You'll adapt, whether you like it or not. Sophie felt a wave of anger rise up inside her, but she pushed it down, trying to think logically. Ryan was right in one respect. She was stuck. She had no way out. But she wasn't about to let him crush her spirit. She could survive this. She would survive this. The question was, how? Sophie's mind continued to race. But she knew that the more she thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. She had no idea what Ryan wanted, what his plans were, or what his game was. All she knew was that she had to keep her wits about her. She had to stay strong. You're right about one thing, Sophie said slowly, meeting Ryan's cold gaze. I don't have a choice. Ryan's expression softened for just a moment, almost imperceptibly. Then learn to play the game, Sophie, he said, his voice quieter now. Because this is the game you're in now. Sophie nodded, a sense of grim determination settling over her. She didn't know what Ryan's game was, but she was about to find out. She wasn't going to lose herself in this. She would survive, and she would make it out of this world on her own terms. The days that followed felt like an endless cycle of uncertainty. Sophie's mind was a whirlwind, and no matter how hard she tried to find a way out, she couldn't see any. Ryan's words echoed in her ears, you'll adapt, whether you like it or not. Each moment spent in his world seemed like an eternity, and Sophie began to feel the weight of her helplessness pressing down on her more and more. Ryan had made it clear that she was no longer in control of her life, and that fact gnawed at her relentlessly. But Sophie refused to let herself succumb to despair. She couldn't. She had to hold on to something, anything, that would keep her grounded. It was the only way she would survive. Sophie spent her days in a daze, moving through each task with robotic precision. She interacted with Ryan when necessary, but her mind was always racing, analyzing, calculating. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be a way to turn the tables. But every time she tried to devise a plan, the walls of Ryan's world seemed to close in tighter. His cold, calculating demeanor never wavered, and it felt like she was always a step behind, trapped in his web. But then one day, something unexpected happened. Ryan was in a rare mood, one that was almost thoughtful. Sophie had seen his calm, unshakable presence before, but this time, there was a flicker of something different. He wasn't dismissive, he wasn't cold. For a brief moment, Sophie saw a side of him that made her wonder if there was more to this situation than just his control over her. You're still here, despite everything, Ryan said, his voice quieter than usual. Sophie looked up at him, surprised by the shift in tone. I told you I wasn't going to give up, she said, her voice steady, though there was a slight tremor beneath her words. Ryan studied her for a moment, as if weighing her every word, before his lips curled into a faint smile. You're stubborn, he said, almost as if it was a compliment. I'll give you that. But stubbornness won't get you anywhere in my world. You'll learn that soon enough. Sophie swallowed, the sting of his words still fresh, but she didn't let it show. She wouldn't let him break her. I'll figure it out, she said, the words more for herself than for him. Ryan's smile faded, replaced by his usual unreadable expression. We'll see, he replied, his voice neutral again. As The days went on. Sophie began to realize something. It wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about trying to escape Ryan's world. It was about taking control of her own life, even if she had to do it in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Sophie knew she couldn't just force her way out of this situation. She couldn't overpower Ryan, and she certainly couldn't challenge him directly. But she had something he didn't have, a mind that was sharp, resourceful, and able to think in ways he couldn't predict. Sophie wasn't going to let herself become a pawn in Ryan's game. She would find a way to navigate it, to play the game her own way. And when the time was right, when she had learned enough, she would make her move. For now, all she had to do was wait. But waiting didn't mean doing nothing. Sophie began to observe more closely, studying Ryan's habits, his interactions, the way he carried himself. She knew that every piece of information could be useful. She was biding her time, playing the long game. Sophie wasn't helpless. She was a survivor. And if there was one thing Ryan hadn't counted on, it was that she could adapt too. She would find her way out of this, even if it meant doing it on her own terms. "I've been watching you," Ryan said suddenly one morning, his voice breaking the silence that had settled over them for the past few days. Sophie, who had been carefully observing him from the corner of the room, froze. His words were so casual, so precise, it was as if he had been waiting for the right moment to say them. Sophie met his gaze, her heart racing as she wondered just how much he knew. She had been careful, but even she couldn't help feeling exposed in his presence. "What does that mean?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the growing anxiety. Ryan took a step closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You think you can outsmart me," he said, his tone not unkind, but filled with something unreadable. "I've been in this game a lot longer than you have. You don't realize it, but I've already seen every move you've tried to make." Sophie swallowed hard. The last few days had been a blur of quiet observation and planning. She had been doing everything she could to understand Ryan's patterns, looking for any cracks in his demeanor, any opportunities she could exploit. But hearing Ryan speak so confidently, so knowingly, shook her. Had her careful strategy been that obvious? "I'm not trying to outsmart you," Sophie said, forcing herself to sound confident. "I'm just trying to survive." Ryan raised an eyebrow, a slight curve appearing at the corner of his mouth. "Survival isn't enough, Sophie. You can't just exist in my world. You need to learn how to play the game. You need to adapt, or you'll get left behind." Sophie felt a flicker of frustration, but pushed it down quickly. She knew Ryan was right in a way. She couldn't just keep waiting for an opportunity to fall into her lap. But what did he mean by playing the game? Was there some other angle to his plans? Ryan had made it clear that he was used to being in control, that he had power over her. But there was something about the way he spoke now, the way his eyes seemed to soften, that made Sophie wonder if there was more to him than the cold businessman she had come to know. "What does that mean, playing the game?" Sophie asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. Ryan's lips twitched, his gaze still intense as he studied her. "It means knowing when to push and when to hold back. It means understanding that nothing is ever as simple as it seems." Sophie thought for a moment, trying to piece together what he was implying. It was like a riddle, one she hadn't figured out yet. But for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. If Ryan was offering her a chance to learn, a way to understand his world on his terms, it could be the opening she needed. "So, you're saying there's a way to be a part of this?" Sophie asked, still unsure, but willing to listen. Ryan's gaze softened just the slightest bit, and for a moment, Sophie thought she saw something human in him, something other than the calculating businessman he portrayed. "There's always a way," he said, his voice quiet now, almost like a secret. "You just have to be willing to play." Sophie let the words sink in. Maybe she wasn't as trapped as she thought. Maybe this was a new beginning, a chance to turn the tables. She had spent so much time trying to figure out how to escape, how to find a way out of Ryan's control. But maybe the key wasn't escaping at all. Maybe the key was learning to thrive in his world, to bend the rules to her advantage, and to play the game just as he had said. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But Sophie was determined. She would play, and when the time was right, she would take control of the game herself. The next few days unfolded with a quiet intensity that Sophie hadn't expected. She found herself observing Ryan with renewed focus, watching his every move, listening to the way he spoke, and trying to decipher the meaning behind his actions. There was a subtle rhythm to the way he operated, a pattern that Sophie began to notice. At first, it was the smallest things, the way he handled his meetings, how he made decisions, how he always seemed to be one step ahead of everyone around him. But the more she watched, the more she realized that Ryan didn't just play the game. He controlled it. And Sophie? She was still just learning the rules. She had no illusions about how difficult this was going to be. She was still trapped in his world, still bound by the circumstances that had brought her here. But as each day passed, Sophie began to feel a shift inside herself. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived. She wasn't the woman who was terrified of making a mistake or of what Ryan might do next. No, she was something else now, something stronger, something smarter. She had come to understand that survival wasn't about running away. It wasn't about escaping Ryan's world. It was about navigating it, understanding it, and using it to her advantage. One afternoon, Ryan called her into his office, his tone as impassive as ever. Sophie walked in, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what he wanted this time, but she knew she couldn't show fear. Not now. Not after everything she had learned. "I've been watching you," Ryan said, his gaze never leaving hers. "You've been learning." Sophie didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. His words were both a compliment and a warning. She could feel the weight of them, the challenge in them. "You think you can outsmart me," Ryan continued, his voice smooth, almost like a game. "But I'm not so easily fooled." Sophie met his gaze head-on. "I'm not trying to outsmart you," she said, her voice steady. "I'm just trying to understand how this works. I'm trying to learn." Ryan's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Learning is good. But be careful, Sophie," he said, his tone turning serious. "This isn't a game you can win by just playing along. You'll need more than that to survive here." Sophie held her ground, refusing to back down. She had heard him say things like this before, but this time, there was something different in his voice, something that hinted at a level of respect. "I'm not looking to win, Ryan," she said quietly. "I'm just looking to get by. For now." There was a long pause before Ryan finally spoke again. "That's what I thought," he said, almost to himself. "But one day, Sophie, you'll realize that just getting by isn't enough. Not in my world." Sophie didn't know what he meant by that, but she didn't press him for an answer. She knew that this wasn't the time to ask questions. "Not yet. You can leave now," Ryan said, his tone neutral. "But remember, you're still learning. And learning never ends." Sophie turned and walked out of his office, her mind spinning with what had just been said. She had survived another conversation with Ryan, but she knew that survival wasn't the end game. It was just the beginning. The more she learned, the more she realized that Ryan was right about one thing. Just getting by wouldn't be enough. If she was going to make it in his world, she would have to do more than simply adapt. She would have to take control. And that meant learning how to play the game, not just as a pawn, but as a player. Sophie didn't know exactly how she was going to do it, but she was more determined than ever. She wasn't just going to survive this world. She was going to own it. "I have to admit, I underestimated you," Ryan said, his voice calm as usual, but with an edge of something like recognition. Sophie looked up from the papers she was organizing, meeting his gaze. The words hit her in a way she hadn't expected. She had heard him speak in the same way before, cool, composed, but this time, there was something different in his eyes. A shift, a slight change. Sophie couldn't help but wonder if he was finally starting to see her for more than just a pawn in his game. She had been working closely with him for weeks now, watching, learning, and adapting. And though she still didn't understand everything about this world, she had made progress. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was learning how to take control. "What do you mean?" Sophie asked cautiously, setting aside the papers she had been organizing. Ryan walked over to the window, staring out at the city below, his back to her. "You've been more observant lately," he said, almost to himself. "You've been learning to read people. And you're getting better at understanding how this world works." Sophie's heart raced. Was this his way of acknowledging her progress? Was he giving her a hint that she wasn't as invisible as she had felt at times? "I'm just trying to figure out the rules," Sophie replied, keeping her tone steady, though her mind was racing. "I'm not looking for approval." Ryan turned back to face her, his eyes studying her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "You don't need my approval," he said, the words coming out almost like a challenge. "But you do need to know when to take the opportunities that come your way. Because in this world, those opportunities don't last long." and you don't get second chances. Sophie's mind raced. He was right, of course. Ryan had always made it clear that life in his world wasn't about taking things for granted. You had to seize what you could when it was in front of you, because nothing would be handed to you. I understand, Sophie said, her voice quieter now. Ryan didn't smile, but there was something in his gaze that seemed almost approving. For a moment, Sophie dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to earn his respect. Good, he said. Keep thinking like that. But remember, the rules you think you understand may not be the rules you're playing by. Sophie's brow furrowed. What was he getting at? He was always so cryptic, always leaving her to figure things out on her own. But that's how he operated. Ryan was never straightforward. He wanted her to learn the hard way. He wanted her to be sharp, to be aware of every little detail. And Sophie was starting to realize that, in this world, that was the only way to survive. So what's next? Sophie asked, her voice more confident now. Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply looked at her, sizing her up, as if he was deciding whether or not she was ready for whatever came next. Next, he finally said, a glint of amusement in his eyes. Next is for you to keep learning. Keep observing. Keep adapting. Sophie nodded, a quiet determination settling over her. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. She wasn't going to settle for just getting by. She was going to make her mark in this world, in his world. She wasn't just going to play by the rules. She was going to rewrite them. I'm ready, Sophie said firmly, meeting his gaze. Ryan's expression softened slightly, and for a brief moment, Sophie could have sworn she saw a flicker of approval in his eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt like she was no longer just a bystander in her own life. She was starting to take control, to shape her own destiny. And she would do whatever it took to keep moving forward, to make sure Ryan, and everyone else, knew that she wasn't someone to be underestimated.